Okay, so we're going to be learning about the topic of an eye for an eye. We mentioned it yesterday on Shabbos briefly, and we're going to go through it. We're going to discover some fascinating stuff. There's money flying everywhere over here. We're going to discover some interesting stuff. If you pay attention, you may even find a very famous literary joke or questionable literary joke. We'll get there. But in order to make sure we're going in straight, let's first read, if not all, but most of the relevant psukim. So if you open up your Chumashim to yesterday's Parsha, Parshas Mishpatim, chapter 21, verse 22 and on. So in the Kaplan Chumash that's in front of you, it's going to be on page 361. 361, in the middle of the page. I'm going to read it in the Hebrew and English, and the reason I'm reading it in the Hebrew and in the English, even though the language of most people here is English, is, well, two reasons. First of all, because we read the holy words of the Torah in its language, but also, as we discussed on Friday night, who was here Friday night, about the mother's milk, that there's there basically is almost no such thing as translation, certainly in contemporary English Chumashim. Any translation that we have today is really by definition interpretation. And so they're useful, but it's also important to try to read it in the original, and even if you're not familiar with the language, to, as much as possible, shave it down to the bare minimum. What do the actual words say? So let's read in Psukim 22 and on. V'chi yinotzu anoshim, and when people fight, v'nogfu isha hara, and they they hurt, or they what's the word? How does he translate it? They harm a pregnant woman. V'yatzu yiladeha, and her fetuses go out, so she loses the pregnancy. V'lo yihya asein, but there is no death of an adult. Onesh onesh, he should be punished. Kasha yashis olav bala isha, as the husband of the woman places upon him v'nasan b'flilim, and it's given through the judges. Okay, so this is not really the pasuk which we're interested in focusing on, but I'll just explain briefly that this means that if a person he hit a pregnant woman, the woman herself survived, but the fetuses remained alive, so we do not consider that to be murder, and there is no death penalty for that, but there is only but he has to give a monetary compensation as the judges determine. The next pasuk 23, Chav Gimel, V'im osin yiyeh, if there is a tragedy, meaning if the woman is killed, v'nosata nefesh tachas nefesh, you give a nefesh, a life, tachas. Now this word tachas is going to be basically the topic of the whole discussion today, but tachas means for, instead of, in lieu of, in place of, a life. Now here there's a big machlokes, which is important for us to bear in mind for today's discussion. What does this mean? Does this mean that if, again, what's going on over here? Ruvain and Shimon are fighting with each other, and then by accident, Ruvain punches Shimon's wife and kills her. So, is Ruvain put to death for that or not? And the crux of the discussion is, obviously murder is a capital offense, but what happens if a person intended to kill one person and accidentally killed somebody else instead? Is that also punishable by death? So if you say it is punishable by death, then nefesh tachas nefesh means a life for a life. You killed, you get killed. If we say he's not liable for death, so then we translate the words nefesh tachas nefesh, that he pays money. Again, we're not getting into how much right now, but he pays money instead. He pays the value of a life, so to speak, instead of the actual life. Then the pasuk continues, and this is what's relevant to us. Ayin tachas ayin, an eye tachas an eye. So if he damages an eye, he has to be giving an eye. Okay, I think everybody sort of knows the punchline here, that we don't actually take out the person's eye, but we give him a financial penalty. What?
Or should we?
Oh, right. Well, that's really the discussion. Okay. Shein tachas shein, a tooth for a tooth. Yad tachas yad, a hand for a hand.
Justice.
Regel tachas regel, a foot for a foot, or a leg for a leg. Kaviyah tachas kaviyah. So pasuk 23 listed limbs or body parts which are very important. Eye you need to see, shin you need to eat, teeth you need to eat, hand and foot you need to get around the place. And then in the next pasuk we say other things which are not damaging usually in the sense of completely disabling a person, but they can be very painful, etc. Kaviyah tachas kaviyah, a burn for a burn. Petza tachas petza, a wound for a wound. Chabura tachas chabura, a bruise for a bruise. Let's translate it as. Okay. Now, let's turn to Parshas Emor, which is Vayikra chapter 24, and Pasuk Yutes 19, and in your Chumash that's in front of you in the Kaplan Chumash, this is going to be on page 631.
Aren't there whole cities like built for people who accidentally kill other people?
Yeah.
All right, let's please try.
This is deliberate.
That's not what
Let's try to stay on topic if that's okay. Thank you.
Well, that's what we're saying. This is deliberate. When somebody causes damage to somebody deliberately,
they deliberately wanted to kill one person, but they...
So over here it says in verse 19, if a person will inflict a wound in his fellow, kasher also as he did to the other, keni also such shall be done to him. So if you were having any doubts as to whether, when we said before an eye for an eye means literally an eye for an eye, if it means money, here it seems even more explicit. As he did, such shall be done to him. Shever tachas shever, broken, I assume that shever means a break, but I guess a broken bone instead of a broken bone. Fracture for a fracture, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Ka'asher yitin mum ba'adam, as a blemish is placed in one person, ken yinasan boy, so shall it be placed in him.
So it doesn't matter if it's accidental or intentional?
Let's talk about intentional for now.
Okay.
Because the crux of the discussion today is why are we going to inflict the wound on the perpetrator or not? And if not, and we're only going to charge him money, why does the Torah express itself the way it does? That's really the main topic of today's discussion. But it's again, like I said, it's a fascinating topic. Right here I have a whole book just on this topic. This is a very modern book, but over the years there's been literally, I would say, thousands of pages of scholarship written on this topic. And then one more important source that we must look at is at the end of Parshas Maseh. So we're looking in the book of Bamidbar now, in the book of Numbers, in chapter 35. And that's going to be in your Kaplan Chumash on page...
Numbers?
1 second. Yeah, on page 857. So the 857.
Okay.
So verse 1 says, Hashem spoke to Moshe ba'arvos Moav, in the plains of Moav, al yad Yerech on the Jordan, on the bank of the Jordan, saying, right? Now the reason I showed you this pasuk is because it's important to bear in mind that this pasuk was said at the end of the 40-year sojourn in the desert, just before in Arvis Moav, before they went into the land. Now turn over one page to verse 31, actually 2 pages, so now we're on page 861 or 860 in the Hebrew, and we're looking at verse 31, and it says, you should not take ransom money for the life of a murderer, who is sentenced to who is a wicked person deserving of death, he must surely die. So it says here that if somebody is to be sentenced to death, you should not have compassion on him and take ransom, but rather you must exact retribution. Okay, clearly, this last pasuk we'll see soon why that was so relevant. But looking at primarily at the first 2 sources that we said from yesterday's parsha in Mishpatim, Exodus chapter 21, and Parshas Achrimos, Vayikra chapter 24. It seems pretty clear that if you were to just read Scripture and not be aware at all of the interpretation of our sages, you would come away certainly with the conclusion that if somebody knocks out somebody's eye, you take out his eye. If somebody breaks somebody's bone, you break his bone. That would seem to be the clear implication. And in fact, this was, not surprisingly, the approach of the Tzedaikim, the Sadducees, who are famous or infamous for always rejecting the teachings of Chazal and only following the actual, so to speak, straightforward, literal meaning of Scripture. They believed that this is actually how you do it. And this is recorded in Megillas Tainis. Megillas Tainis is a Tanaic work which talks about what's special about all different dates in the calendar. And it says that on the 14th of Tammuz is a very special day. It's a day of celebration. Why? Because that the Baisusim, the Tzedaikim Baisusim, the various groups of heretics, they would interpret ayin tachas ayin literally, that if a person knocks out somebody's eye or tooth, you have to do so to him. And other things in the Torah which they interpreted literally, for example, the Yarka B'fanav, when Chalitza is performed, and the woman has to spit. So Chazal say that she has to spit on the floor in front of the assembled, or in front of the brother-in-law. But they learned the Yarka B'fanav that she actually has to spit into his face. Oh, and other such examples. But the Torah said, the sages said to the heretics over there, how could you possibly say this? The Torah says you should write down the Torah and the mitzvah which I commanded them to teach them. So in other words, it's explicit within Scripture that there's also an oral tradition of a guide to how to interpret Scripture. So how could you take one without the other? And on that day, which they, I guess there was some sort of victory over in the argument over the Sadducees, was considered a day of celebration. The 14th day of Tammuz, once upon a time, was a day of celebration, and the victory of the Masorah, the tradition of Chazal, over those who seek to reject it. Later on in the class today, we'll see a little bit more details as to what the nature of the proofs that the sages brought against the Sadducees are. Now, how do we in fact know that ayin tachas ayin means money, and not that you don't knock out the person's eye, take out the person's eye, but rather he gives money? So in the Gemara in Bava Kama, there are no less than 10 limudim, 10 opinions of how we know this. In other words, everybody has probably tasted some Gemara before, where the Gemara brings, the pasuk says this, and it could have said it like this, or it should have said it like that, or we have a similar word from this pasuk to that pasuk. There's all different methods of what we call biblical exegesis, of how we deduce and determine things based on pasukim. And in a lengthy sugya in the Gemara in Bava Kama, there are no less than 10 different opinions as to how exactly we know that ayin tachas ayin means money rather than actually taking out the person's eye. So we're not going to go through all 10 of them. That would be a little bit tedious. But generally speaking, we could divide those 10 into 3 different groups. The first is the translation of the word tachas. So some of the statements, both of Chazal and even later of the Rishonim, get into this idea of what does the word tachas actually mean. So tachas could mean in place of. So for example, in Haksav HaKabbalah from Mecklenburg, right? So he elaborates on this. He elaborates on this, and he brings different places where you sometimes tachas means that one thing fills the place of another, like we would say a successor. So a successor is referred to in the Torah. In one place we have HaKohen HaMashiach Tachtov Mibonov. You have the Kohen Gadol, and then when he passes, his son succeeds him. So that is referred to as Tachtov, or Tachas, instead of in the place of him. So there you're saying A is filling the place of B, or B is filling the place of A. Right. Then, or you could have Tachas, meaning A is tachas B, it means A is caused by B. So, for example, we have many of these examples in the Torah. One is, let's say, v'sachas ki ohavas avisecha, because he loved your ancestors. Therefore, vayivcher bezari achrov, he chose his the descendants to as his nation, right? Or tachas asher ino. This example is brought by the Gemara that if a person rapes a girl, so then he has to pay the fine. Tachas, because asher ino, he caused her to suffer. Many other examples like this. So over there, we can't say, let's say, we're not saying tachas asher ino, that the fine that the person pays sort of undoes the rape. Not saying that, there's a Kohen Gadol and then there's a successor and B fills the places of A. We're not saying that B fills the place of A. We're saying that A causes B. Because you raped him, therefore you have to pay this fine. So here also what we're arguing is that ayin tachas ayin doesn't really replace, knocking out your eye, the offender's eye isn't going to replace the eye of the person who was. So it can't mean tachas in that sense, and therefore it must mean tachas in the second sense, that because you did this, therefore we're going to do that. Now, so because you did this, therefore we're going to do that, meaning therefore we're going to charge you money, not necessarily therefore we're going to...
The fair value of an eye.
Right. Now, but it's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the questions, which hopefully we'll have a chance to touch on briefly at least, is whose eye are you taking? The value of whose eye? The value of the eye of the perpetrator, or the value of the eye of the victim? But we'll get to that. Okay, so that's one theme in the Gemara. Another theme.
Does that mean a replacement eye or just money?
Money.
No replacement.
Well, whatever that might be included, the cost of that might be included. I don't know that there was such a thing as a replacement eye back in the day.
But now there could be though.
All right.
It's modern technology.
I don't think so.
Another category in the Gemara is that the pasuk says, and if you turn back to the psukim we looked at in Leviticus chapter 24, 22, it says, Mishpat echad hi alachem, there should be one law for you, for everyone. So the Gemara says, and various different iterations of this, that you can't really, if you're going to actually take out the person's eye, then you can't have one rule for everybody, because sometimes it's not going to be possible. What if the person who the perpetrator was already blind? Or what if he's big and he's smaller, he's more short? There could be so many differences. You could only actually do the same thing to A and B, exactly the same in the mishpat echad, in the universal exact case, if the two people are exactly the same scenario. And sometimes that's not even possible, because you don't know for sure that by inflicting the wound on the perpetrator that you're not going to accidentally make it even worse a wound or even kill him. What if you're going to do something that's going to, he broke his ribs and you're going to break this guy's ribs, and by mistake you're going to break his spine while you're at it. So it's not really
like precise surgeons for this.
So the fact that the Torah says mishpat echad, that there's a universal rule for all, teaches us that it cannot be that you inflict the wound, because we cannot act with such precision, and even if we could, there are situations when it's inherently impossible, like for example, like I said, if the perpetrator was already blind before he started, and so therefore it must mean financial things.
I mean, another kind of thing would be, let's say a person's like an MLB pitcher. He's known to have a great arm, and so he caused the damage to the other person's arm, and this person's kind of like, he might do something that doesn't require anything physical. He might have an intellectual kind of profession. So for you to take away that MLB pitcher's arm in response to it, it's not really equivalent. It's not really an arm for an arm. It's like, it's technically an arm for an arm, but it's not the same arm for that.
Exactly.
For the arm.
The lost opportunity.
Now, Lloyd's of
that's going to cost him his entire income.
Lloyd's of London will insure anything. So Marilyn Monroe's legs were insured for $10 million a piece. And
exactly.
They were insured. So
exactly.
They have insurance back
They actually have an actual value.
You don't need to have that though.
Huh?
You don't need necessarily to have
no, but they did purchase that insurance.
Yeah, no, I realize that.
All right, and then another approach goes like this. We saw the pasuk in Parshas Masei in the end of Bamidbar, where it says, "Do not take your ransom for the life of a murderer." Right, now, what could you deduce from there?
Do not take a
Do
loan.
not
do
take
not take-
money. In other words, if somebody's a murderer and he needs to be put to death, don't take money from him to bail out of the death penalty. But we could deduce from there that whom can you not take a bailout money for? A murderer. But if it's Rosh Ivarim, if he didn't murder, he just damaged the person's body but didn't actually murder, then you can take ransom.
See, the Pasuk also says, Rabbi, that if he was put in a refuge city and the Kohen died, don't even let him leave the city.
Yeah, because that's all we're talking about a murderer.
Right.
But if he's not a murderer, so then you don't have, then you can take, you could deduce from that you can take a ransom. Now, I should point out, and this touches on what you said, that there is an opinion in the Gemara, Rabbi Lezer, that says ayin tachas ayin mamish. Rabbi Lezer says no, an actual eye for an eye. And the Gemara says, what? How could it? But no, that's completely beyond the parameters of our tradition. How could Rabbi Lezer say that? And so Tosfos explain that, and based on other Rishonim, the one of the explanations that certainly in Rabbi Lezer is that what he means to say is that he deserves for his eye to be taken out, and hopefully we'll have some time to elaborate on that a little bit more. But what's the practical ramifications of this? That he's saying the reason why the Torah says an eye for an eye is because that's what he deserves to happen. And therefore you should know, and that also teaches you, because that's what deserve, that also teaches you the nature of the payment. Because when you have to, when if Ruvain takes out Shimon's eye, and then we say, okay, you have to pay, but we're not going to take out your eye, you have to pay money. So how much money does he have to pay? Does he have to pay the value of what he damaged? So you took out Shimon's eye, so somehow we have to come up with a price tag on Shimon's eye, and that's what you have to compensate him. So you might now made his life, if for example he was insured. How much would Shimon's eye have been insured for? Or in ancient terminology we say, how much would Shimon have been sold on the slave market for, with an eye, without an eye? That's the price tag on Shimon's eye. That's one approach. Or you could say, no, you, Ruvain, deserve for your eye, not you, deserve for your eye to be taken out. So we're not going to actually do that. Instead, you're going to pay ransom for your own eye. So according to that method, the amount of money Reuven's going to have to pay is not how much money Shimon's eye was worth, but how much money his own eye is worth.
Which could be deficient or less than.
Right, maybe.
What's that? Can you make that point again?
The main mazik or the main nizik? If you're paying the damages, then you're paying for the price of the victim's eye.
Right.
If you're saying, no, that really you deserve to have your own eye knocked out, but for whatever reason we're not going to actually do that, whether because that's not going to help anybody, or because it's not practical to implement, or whatever it is, and therefore you're going to pay a ransom. You pay what's the ransom? The ransom is you pay the value of the perpetrator's eye, not the value your own. So the perpetrator pays the victim of value of his own eye.
That's what mamish means. Right?
Yeah, that's one of the interpretations. Yes.
Oh,
Okay. Now,
that's-
one of the
Just a quick question. So, the Torah says damages have to be paid in compensation in some form. Let's say I'm the injured party, I lose an eye, whatever. Do I have the ability to say to that person, you know what, you don't have to pay me for whatever reason, they have Rachamanis, or maybe it's a brother or whatever. Do I have the ability to go against the Torah and say no?
Yes, there's a general rule in all financial matters, basically, besides interest, that you could always, that when it comes to money, you could always forego a loan, you can say, if I owe you money, you don't need to. Yes.
But if the interpretation is it's an organ for an organ, I'm not talking about money, would I have the ability to say?
Yes. I still think so. That's good. Interesting point, but I still don't think that would change.
The
Okay.
whole thing about
Now,
time.
before we look at the Rambam, I need to give you some history, and here's where we're going to get. Here's where we're going to get into something a little bit comical. So, throughout the last millennia, one of the areas of Torah study that has taken up the time of many a scholar is finding sources for what the Rambam says. The Rambam, one of the most important works that we have, he wrote massive halachic work, and he doesn't provide sources for what he says. Now, obviously, 90-something% of what the Rambam says is not difficult to find. You learn the Masechta, if you the laws of Shabbos, you learn the Masechta in Gemara about Shabbos, and the Bavli, and in the Yerushalmi, and in all the Brises, and all the works we have, and you're going to find the source. But every so often there are things that the Rambam say that we don't have a source for. Now, the first person who was baffled by this problem was none other than the Rambam himself.
That's why I was smiling.
Right? The Rambam himself, in a letter,
I don't know where I got this.
to Rav Pinchas Hadayan, he writes that he's intending and hoping to publish himself a supplement work to the Mishnah Torah, in which he's going to provide the source for everything that he wrote, which is not in, he's not going to go through Hilchos Shabbos and show how everything is in the Gemara in Shabbos, but anything that's in the laws of Shabbos that is taken from other places, from the laws of Gittin, the Gemara, by the way, mentions something about Shabbos, all those things he's going to publish a work with the sources. Now, the Rambam, as far as we know, never got around to it. And the Rambam himself describes a very frustrating episode that he experienced, that he was one time, he found the halacha in his own sefer, which he could not find the source for. And he said, if it's a Makkas, it's a Nivamis, and Gittin, and he just couldn't find the source for it. Now, scholars have subsequently at least guessed which halacha it was that the Rambam couldn't find the source for, and why he couldn't find it, and where the source actually is. That's not for now. But this issue of finding sources in the Rambam has always been a something which has busied Torah scholars. Now,
Can I just have a quick question? So does that suggest that he vicariously wrote a point of view? Or
no, the Rambam emphasizes in that very letter, that there is nothing in the entire work, there is not a single thing that is his own interpretation, unless he says so explicitly. If he says Yeroy Ali or something like that, then you know it's his. But if it's not that, then you should be 1,000% sure he really lays it on thick in that letter that there is a source for it, and if you can't find it, it's because you haven't searched.
I always assumed that he was at Tzaddik and he got it directly from Hashem. I mean, now I know you're going to tell me otherwise, but
Okay.
that's what
Now,
I always assumed.
historically, we have midrashim. We've had for forever, from the time of the Noam, we've had midrashim. The Medrash, for example, on Bamidbar and Dvarim is Sifri and is Sifra. The Medrash on Vayikra is Sifri. The Medrash on the book of Shemais that we've always had is Mechilta. It's called Mechilta. Now, the Mechilta is midrashim. It's we're talking here about halachic midrashim, not agadic midrashim. So these are the halachic teachings, and it's Mechilta. The one that we've always had is called Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, the Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael on the book of Shemais. Now, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, we actually discussed this recently, I think, but Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva represent two different schools of thought in general, and so the Medrashim that we have on Vayikra and Bamidbar, Sifri and Sifra, they follow the school of Rabbi Akiva, and the Medrash of Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael on Shemais follows, like the name suggests, Rabbi Yishmael, the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Now, we know, we've always known, that there once upon a time was a book called Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai on Shemais. That the Mechilta of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, which also follows the school of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, they're the same school, that follows the school of Rabbi Akiva, that existed. We know that it existed because we see early Rishonim and Gaonim quoting it, but it had been for many, many centuries completely lost to us. We only knew that of its existence from secondary sources. Now, this all changed after the discovery of the Cairo Geniza. The Cairo Geniza contained fragments of Medrash, which seemed to be, which were very small fragments, which were proven to be from Mechilta de Reb Shimon ben Yochai. By the way, this whole summary of the different Mechiltas was written up by somebody who I follow on Twitter last week, so I'm taking it from him. Not everybody agrees with all the details of how he presents it, but I'm just presenting it how he presents it. So we started getting fragments of this Mechilta de Reb Shimon ben Yochai, and then what happened was there was a Yemenite Talmud Chacham who published a Medrash called Medrash HaGadol. Medrash HaGadol is a anthology of many different midrashim, but based on the discoveries from the Cairo Geniza and taking together from Medrash HaGadol, scholars were able to take out from the Medrash HaGadol parts that belonged to Mechilta de Reb Shimon ben Yochai. And so, in I want to say in the early 1900s, for the first time, no, maybe mid-1900s, like maybe the 1940s or 50s, somewhere there, I believe. For the Cairo Geniza is discovered at the early 1900s, maybe even the late 1800s. I think in the 1940s or 50s, for the first time, Mechilta de Reb Shimon ben Yochai was published as a whole book. Taken all the segments from the Medrash HaGadol, from this Yemenite Medrash, that scholars were able to prove, based on linguistics and style and all different things, that they belong to Mechilta de Reb Shimon ben Yochai, were published as a book alone. This was a huge, for many centuries, this book was considered completely lost to us, and now it had returned. Comes along, enter Reb Mendel Kasher. Reb Menachem Mendel Kasher was a huge genius, somebody who accomplished things which it's almost unimaginable to understand how a person could accomplish so much without the tools that we have today, the search tools and everything. And his most monumental project is the Torah Shlema, where he publishes the entire Torah and the entire Chumash, and puts all of Torah Shabbal Peh that's connected to the pasuk on those psukim, and his commentary and his notes and his essays on it are just unparalleled and unimaginable in their depth and breadth. Now, so Reb Mendel Kasher, he's made a discovery, and he said that if you look through the entire 14 books of the Rambam, and look at all the passages of Rambam that scholars over the years have failed to find at least a convincing source for, you will see that many of them, their source is none other than the Mechilta de Reb Shimon ben Yochai. This book that had been missing for so many centuries, now that we have it, we can point to so many Rambams that come from the Mechilta de Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Until now, everything I've said is fact. Nothing I've said until now. I mean, maybe I'm off with some detail. Now,
well, you said this is somewhere in the mid 1900s.
Yeah.
1940s.
I believe that Reb Mendel Kasher's first edition of this book was published in 19. I'll tell you exactly. The first edition of his book, of Mendel Kasher's book, was printed in 1943, and the first edition of Mechilta de Rashbi was published in. I'll tell you exactly.
Where was he from, Rabbi?
I'm not sure. The first edition of Rambam Mechilta de Rashbi from Mendel Kasher was printed in 1943. Subsequently, it was discovered, more fragments of Geniza were discovered, and in 1955, so we're talking here 13 years after Mendel Kasher publishes his first edition of Mechilta de Rashbi, a new edition of Mechilta de Rashbi was published based on new fragments of Geniza from Cairo that were discovered and further analyzed and with painstaking work of all these scholars. And according to this new edition in 1955 is published by two scholars by the name of Epstein and Melamed, and what they I'm sorry, I'm missing one piece here in the puzzle. So again, in 1943, Mendel Kasher publishes this work demonstrating many passages in the Rambam that their source is Mechilta de Rashbi. However, there is a scholar by the name of Zeitlin, Shnei Zalman Zeitlin or Solomon Zeitlin, and he further analyzed things, and he says that there's mistakes. There are things that are published in Mechilta de Rashbi that cannot be from Reb Shimon ben Yochai. They must be later sources. That whoever, the original scholar, what's his name, Meir Bar Shalom, who published the Mechilta de Rashbi, he was analyzing Medrash HaGadol, and he thinks that these passages belong there, but actually they're much later. So, for example, one of the examples this guy on Twitter gave is that in Mechilta de Rashbi, in the original, you have a phrase, Churban Bayis Sheni, the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, this Zeitlin proves that referring to the Second Temple as Bayis Sheni, as the Second Temple, that terminology was first coined in Amoraic times. So it cannot be that passage belongs in Mechilta de Rashbi, which is a Tanaic work. So he proved that things crept into Mechilta de Rashbi that don't belong there, and so things that Reb Mendel Kasher is attributing as to be the source of the Rambam cannot actually, in fact, have been the source to the Rambam. Now, then fast forward to 1955. There's a new there's a new edition of Mechilta Darashpi published based on further analytics from scholars and new discoveries from the Geniza, and they publish a new edition of Mechilta Darashpi. Based on his work, what some scholars argued, I don't know that Kasher ever acquiesced to this argument, but some scholars argued that the Yemenites, besides having a lot of manuscripts that we didn't have in the rest of the Jewish world, they also had a very, very big admiration, and we know this from many places. They had a tremendous admiration to the Rambam. And so when this Rabbi Adani is publishing his Medrash HaGadol, and he's including parts from all different texts that he considers important, including Mechilta Darashpi, he's also including passages from the Rambam. And so we end up with what some are claiming to be this literary joke, where there are passages from the Rambam which were incorporated in Medrash HaGadol, which were then misunderstood to be parts of Mechilta Darashpi, which Mendel Kasher then understands to be sources for the Rambam. So the source for the unknown source for the Rambam turned out to be none other than the Rambam himself, right?
Full circle.
Right.
It sounds the same. It's like almost the same
Full
words.
circle.
Right, exactly. So until this,
The Yemenites.
And-
Thank you.
This is identical wording.
Until-
the source.
all right, and then in
Going
19,
to Harvard.
in
2,500 years in Yemen, they cooked it.
In 1980, Rabbi Kasher publishes a new version of his Rambam Mechilta Darashpi, updated based on new discoveries and new things from the Geniza. Again, I don't know that Kasher actually admitted to. I think he still claims. And again, I didn't have time to read through all the different versions of the thing. Okay, what's all this got to do with Ayin Tachas Ayin? Okay, so the Rambam, in his halachic work in the Mishnah Torah and the laws of Chayvel Mazik, chapter 1, he starts out from halacha base through halacha 6, establishing that ayin tachas ayin does not mean that you take out the person's eye; it means that he pays a fine. So it says, he goes like this. This that it says in the Torah, an eye for an eye. This that it says that in Emor, that as he does the blemish, so you should blemish him back. What it means is that he is worthy, he deserves to be taken out a limb, and therefore he has to pay. And therefore he has to pay. And where do we see this in the Torah? So he brings the proof from the Gemara, which we mentioned before, that it says, "Don't take a ransom for a murderer." From whence you can deduce that you do take a ransom for somebody who has caused damage. Then the Rambam continues, and he says, "Where do you know that? From where do we know that when it says with the Rosh Havarim that an eye for an eye, that it means money?" And he brings a new source, and this is a source that we haven't seen yet. It doesn't say this anywhere in the Gemara. And this source says like this. One of the things, it says an eye for an eye, but then later in the pasuk it says a wound for a wound. Now when we're talking about a wound, we have other sources to contrast this with, because earlier on in the parsha, it says clearly that if somebody wounds somebody else, he pays money. So therefore, when it says a wound for a wound, it must mean that he pays money, not that you actually inflict a wound in the perpetrator, because earlier it said money. So therefore, we can also deduce from there that an eye for an eye doesn't mean you knock out his eye, it means he pays money. And then the Rambam continues with a very important line, and he says, even though, sorry?
What was the key, what's the rhyme of it? The money that comes?
Early on it says, where it says, Shifta Yitim Yirapi, that if a person inflicts a wound, he pays money. So later on, when it says a wound for a wound, it cannot mean that you actually give him a wound, because it already said that you pay him money. Then he continues, and he says, even though that everything that I've described can be deduced from the written law, from Scripture, nevertheless, these are all explicitly also taught from Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, and this is how our ancestors witnessed being judged from the time of the Beis Din of Yehoshua, from the Beis Din of Yehoshua and Shmuel, etc. There was never a time that the Jewish people actually enforced this type of law of an eye for an eye. Literally, it was always financial payment. Right away, Frektelach Mishnah, a number of questions, but one of his questions is this whole second pasuk that the Rambam brings, that because it says chabura, that a wound pays money, therefore chabura tachas chabura must mean money, therefore ayin tachas ayin must also mean money. Where in the world does the Rambam get this from? And he finishes off by saying maybe the Rambam found this somewhere, or he had some girsa in the Gemara.
That needs a source. That kind of argumentation, which is
The Rambam doesn't give his own biblical limudim.
But it's not a limit. It's like a logical. It's saying here. It's
Rambam,
saying explicitly it's money.
No, the
so
Rambam
then it must be earlier when it's.
The Rambam does not do that in Mishnah Torah.
Not just that, why does he need the second source?
Yeah, the Mishnah asked that also. 100% good question. But the Mishnah finishes off by saying perhaps there's some place where the Rambam found such a drasha, or he had a different gears in the Gemara. Who knows? And he finishes off with Sarachion. Comes Mendel Kasha in his book on Parshas Mishpatim, and he demonstrates that in fact, like many other things, this unknown source of the Rambam is none other than the Mechilta de Rashbi. Okay? Now, so the Rambam brings this source, which we now know is from Mechilta de Rashbi, and then he goes on to say that this is how we've always done things all the way back to the times of Yehoshua. Now let's go back a little bit.
Why would he bring Mechilta above 3 answers of Gemara?
Oh, excellent question. Excellent question.
What was the question?
Why, if the Gemara brings not the 310, I said there's 3 categories. Why, if there's 10 answers in the Gemara, why does the Rambam prefer this one answer in the Medrash? So Kasher writes about that. I wasn't going to get into it, but now that you ask, Kasher wants to Taina, and again he does this very elaborately with a lot of different proofs, etc. That one of those 10 answers in the Gemara is the second half of this Mechilta de Rashbi, and there's basically the Gemara doesn't bother quoting the whole source from the Medrash, but really that's what the Gemara means to say. Anyway, if you want to see inside, I can show it to you. All right, now let's go back. We're going to come back to the Rambam in a moment, but let us see. We promised to get back to the Sadducees. So, Ben Zuta was a famous Karaite scholar. And in fact, we mentioned on Friday night about the Ibn Ezra, one of the, I think you could arguably say the most famous polemical comment of the Ibn Ezra is in Parshas Mishpatim, where he quotes a Ben Zuta, and whenever the Ibn Ezra quotes these guys, he has little patience for them. And Ben Zuta translates Shei, it says if an ox scores the ox of his friend, so Re'ehu, who's the friend? The friend is the owner of the second ox, right? Ben Zuta says no. Shei Re'ehu means if an ox scores the ox that's his friend. In other words, that one ox scores another. And that's how he translates the pasuk. We're not going to get into now why he translated that, what his intention was.
How it makes a difference.
But
right?
yeah, it makes a difference, whatever. Ibn Ezra goes on refuting the whole thing. And then the last line, and this is the very famous line of the Ibn Ezra, Ve'ein l'shoireya ela ben zuta be'atzmai, that oxen don't have friends besides Ben Zuta. He could be a friend to an ox. Okay, so this Ben Zuta, he features over here in argumentation with Reb Sadia Goin on the meaning of Ayin Tachas Ayin. And I found it interesting to note that, to my knowledge, the only time in his entire commentary on the Torah that Rashi references Reb Sadia Goin, even though Sadia Goin lived many years before Rashi, but lived certainly before Rashi, the only time that I'm aware, that as far as I know, there's only one single time in his entire commentary to the Chumash that Rashi quotes Reb Sadia, and that is in Parshas Mishpatim, towards the end, where Rashi teaches us that that the 10 dibros, the Aseres HaDibros, incorporate some reference or allusion to all the 613 mitzvahs, and Rashi says that in the piyut that was established by Reb Sadia, he does the work for you to show you how all 613 of the mitzvahs are included in the Aseres HaDibros. So it's just, I found that interesting that Rashi quotes Reb Sadia one and only time in his Pirush to Chumash. Anyway, so let me read to you a little bit of the conversation between Reb Sadia Goin and Ben Zuta. I don't know. So, Omer Reb Sadia, we cannot translate this pasuk literally, that if a person hits an eye and causes him to lose a third of his eyesight, how are you going to be able to do that back? You're not going to be able to scientifically, take away a third of his eyesight. Maybe you'll make him fully blind. Maybe he'll die. This cannot be. So Ben Zutta says back to Sadia, it seems, again, I'm not 100% familiar with the history here, but it seems like Ben Zutta and Sadia are actually having this conversation. So Ben Zutta says to him, what do you mean? It says clearly in Parshas Achri Beis, like we saw, Kasha Yitein Mumba Adam, as the person wounds the other, Keini Nosam Boy, so it shall be done to him. So Reb Sadia said to him that you have to Yeshlanu Beis Tachas Al, instead of so shall you do to him, it's so shall you place upon him, meaning you place upon him the financial punishment. So they argued up and back. He says, Kenya also loy. It says you should do it to him. It doesn't say you should do it on him, which would mean to impose a punishment. And then Reb Sadia quotes back to him a pasuk from Shimshon. That Shimshon said, Kasha also li, just like they, the Plishtim, did to me, so will I do to them. So he says, what do you mean? Shimshon didn't do back what they did to him. He didn't take their wives and give them, he didn't, it means he took revenge. It doesn't mean that he did the same thing back to him. So it's the exact same language. So then Ben Zutta says to him, hold on, if you're going to say it means money, what are you going to do if the person is poor and doesn't have any money? So he says, and what are you going to do? So Reb Sadia says back to him, okay, so if there's no exceptions, then what are you going to do? What happens if the perpetrator is blind? How are you going to do it? What are you going to do then? And a poor person, at least there's a possibility, remote as it may be, that he may one day become wealthy and be able to pay up. Mm-hmm. But a blind person will never be able to see again, and then you make him blind again. Therefore, says Reb Sadia, we can never understand any of the mitzvahs of the Torah if we do not rely on the words of Chazal, as we receive the tradition from our ancestors of how to explain the Torah. Then he gives other examples. He says, what if he knocks out a tooth and he's a child, that he's going to get he's going to get another tooth later on in life? What if he gives the example that you gave, not chas v'shalom of basketball, but similar things? Yeah. Okay.
A surgeon
right.
with his hand.
Chas v'shalom. All sports are the same.
Football.
No, whatever. Anyway, I'm just teasing you. Fine. Then he quotes from the Kuzari. He says, there's another pasuk that says, somebody who hits an animal, somebody who kills an animal, should pay it a life for a life, right? So he says, what are you going to say? That if somebody kills your horse, that you kill his horse back? What's the point of that? He kills your horse, so maybe you should take his horse to use instead of yours. Well, he kills your horse, so I would kill his horse. That doesn't make any sense. And there also, it's the same language, nefesh tachas nefesh. He says if he knocks off your hand, you're going to knock off his hand. What's that going to help you? Okay, so he goes on, the Kuzari goes on with that. Fine, there's more similar sources like that. On a little bit more of a mystical level, you have the Rikanti, or the Rekanati, I think it's supposed to be pronounced, who says that the reason why the Torah uses the words nefesh tachas ayin is to teach you another lesson, that every mitzvah, the truth is already Reb Sadia writes that every word of the Torah has secrets of the Torah hidden behind it, and we don't know really why the Torah words it in a certain way. But the Rekanati, who's a Kabbalist, he says that it's teaching you that every part of the body corresponds to a supernal, so to speak, part of Hashem's body, and whenever you do something good or bad, you're affecting a cataclysmic change because it affects Lamaila. So that's why Ayin Tachas Ayin, we're telling you that obviously in practice you're just going to pay money, but you should know that by knocking out somebody's eye, you've actually inflicted real damage in your neshama, in say the Hishtalshalos, in sort of the cosmic, exactly. All right, now.
I think it's probably the worst part is causing the damage in this realm, but that's just me. I mean,
you're not such a Kabbalist. What could
like you hurt my arm here, but some stalshless arm.
But it's not just about. I think the Rekanati's point.
This one hurts.
No, but I think his point is broader than just an arm for an arm. I think he's saying that this is a general lesson the Torah is telling you, that anytime a person does any avera, that what's happening, the damage done is more than what meets the eye.
Well, and that's, I wrote down a question for later, but I'll ask it now because it's related. So I haven't heard any discussion about compensating for pain and suffering.
Yeah, so that's there's five. When a person damages somebody else, there's 5 categories of payment that have to be done. There's nezak, tzar, ripui, shavis, beishas. So we'll go through them quickly. Nezak is the damage. That's what we're talking about now. How much damage did he cause him? That means, like we said before, what would he have cost in the slave market before? What does he cost in the slave market now? Then there's tzar. Tzar is the pain. And the way Chazal say is, okay, let's say you amputated his arm. So nezak, you've already paid for his arm. You don't owe him that anymore. But what would be the difference between, let's say the guy had to have his arm amputated and he could do it pain-free or with the pain that you inflicted him. How much would he pay for that difference, right? Let's say, let's use modern terms, he had to have his arm amputated and he could do it with anesthesia or without. What would he pay for that difference? That's how we value the price tag for the pain. That's tzar. Sheves is to pay for how much time he was out of work. Ripui is to pay his medical bills, and Boishas is if there was a humiliation involved. So all of these things, 5 different categories, have to be evaluated how much they're worth, and that's what he has to pay.
Now, are all those categories derived from these pasuks we've discussed, or does that come from
Yeah.
something else?
No, well, not necessarily from only these psukim, but they're all derived from pasukim, yes.
But for murder, it's worse because it's not only an individual, it's if he could have a family or children and his legacy, correct?
Exactly, yeah. Damage 100%. Now, I need to get back to telling you one fascinating suggestion which Rabbi Shlomo Mendel Kasher makes, and this spans over many pages in his book over here, that he wants to suggest like this. In Mara, which is right after the splitting of the sea, the Jews are given the Jews are given certain mitzvahs. Which mitzvahs are they given? So according to some opinions, the laws of mishpatim that we read yesterday were given then.
Yeah.
Now, problem is that some of those laws cannot be fully implemented or even understood before Sinai. For example, one of the laws of mishpatim is that if the slave wants to stay, then his ear is pierced, and he remains a slave forever. How long is forever?
Till Yovel.
Till the year of Yovel, yeah?
Jubilee.
Till the Jubilee, then he gets freed. The whole concept of Yovel doesn't exist until Sinai. As it says explicitly in Parshas Bahar, an introduction to the rule of Yovel, that this was said at Sinai.
Right.
So, you're telling me, Vavadi la'olam, right? So one way of understanding it is that there were certain laws that had different parameters when they were given in Mara, and those parameters were updated later on. Now, when is later on? It could be Sinai, it could be even later. So, for example, the Ramban wants to suggest that the mitzvah of circumcision has 3 parts, right? Mila, Priya, and Metzitza. We're going to talk just about Mila and Priya. Mila means to circumcise, to remove the foreskin, and Priya means that after you remove the foreskin, there is some thin membrane that remains over there, and there's a mitzvah to remove that, to remove that as well. So the Ramban makes the argument that the mitzvah of Mila, as it applied in the desert, did not include that second step, and it was only before going into the land that it included that second step. Now,
So they weren't
says
properly circumcised.
that wasn't included in the mitzvah of Mila then.
Priya wasn't.
Priya wasn't. Says Torah Shlema, he brings many examples for this. So therefore, he wants to suggest that this would be according to Rabbi Lezer. Remember, we said Rabbi Lezer holds that nefesh the ayin ba'ayin means literally, and we said, oh no, it can't mean literally. He says maybe it does mean literally, and what he means to say is, what was the source that the Rambam brought? The first source that it doesn't mean literally eye for an eye, because it says don't take ransom for a murderer. So we deduce from that you can't take ransom for somebody who damaged, right? Where does it say that? Remember where I pointed out when we saw that pasuk that was given at the end of the 40 years. So it could be that initially when ayin b'tachas ayin was given in Mara, it meant take out the guy's eye. 40 years later, it was updated to mean only you take money for it. You don't actually take out his eye. Now, it also, this touches upon the whole topic of the contrasting mitzvahs in the Torah between man and man, as they relate to other codes of the time, like, how do you say this in English? You said this to me yesterday, the Marab.
Oh, the Hammurabi.
The Hammurabi or the Hittite codes. So there's a lot of, and we're not going to get into now, but I just want to point out, like, it could be that, during the time in the desert where we're looking to sort of be better than them, we're doing that, we're doing it one way, or to somehow cooperate with them, and then that could be a reason possibly for change. That's just a wild suggestion. Take it or leave it. Let's try. We have a few minutes left. I want to try and finish a few things, and then we'll have time for discussion afterwards. We just have to have a lot more to pack in if possible. Now. Another very, very important source about this whole topic is the Rambam's word in his guide for the perplexed in the Moreh Nevuchim. And I'm going to read you the way it's referenced by the Rambam's own son, Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam, in his commentary to the Torah on this pasuk. He says, "Ayin tachas ayin pashti dekro mevur." The Rambam, this is originally written in Arabic, so this is a translation. This is a straightforward meaning of the pasuk is clear, that it means actually an eye for an eye. However, Biur HaKabbalah, tradition teaches us shekavanas hamikra demei shein tachashen v'chein kulam, that it refers to the money of an eye or a tooth for a tooth. There is basis for this tradition already in the psukim themselves and in the intellectual proofs. Comes from Rabbi Al-Beruji, as Rabbi Sadia himself writes, and we saw before the discussion between Rabbi Sadia and Ben Zuta. And then he brings the proof that the Rambam brought that we now know comes from Mechilta de Rashbi. And then he says, Ola Abamari Zal B'Moira, my father in his guide, Ramaz Bazeh, he alludes to the fact that he has given over Pirush al Peh, a verbal interpretation, Boy Hachron Nifla, which has a wondrous synthesis. Bein HaKabbalah Pshat HaMikra, some fantastic way to synthesize between the tradition and the actual straightforward meaning of the pasuk. But I can't tell it to you, because he has hidden it. So the Rambam writes that explicitly in the Moreh, in chapter in the Chelik Gimel, volume part 3 of the Moreh. I'm pretty sure it's chapter Mem Aleph, 41. Where the Rambam writes clearly that there's something here which I can't tell you. It's a secret. I'm going to tell it to you, but I can't write it down here. And this, of course, as you can imagine, has baffled scholars trying to guess what exactly is this tremendous secret that the Rambam has, which is going to somehow shed light on this entire topic, which he cannot tell us. Now, different interpretations have been suggested. And hopefully we're going to leave you with a little bit of a shock factor. So one suggestion made by Reb David Tzvi Hoffman and others is that, and this kind of ties in with some ideas which I sprinkled throughout the last hour, that perhaps there's a biblical and rabbinic level going on in here. That on a biblical level, and this ties back to the Rambam of the Sikh Kofer, that perhaps on a biblical level, when the Torah says don't take ransom for a murderer, but you can't, so we deduce you can't take ransom for such a person, it just means an allowance. So from a biblical level you have a choice. You could either knock out the person's eye or you could charge him money. And then Chazal came along and they established, no, we're always going to use the second option and never revert to the first option. So that is one suggestion that's possibly made as what the Rambam means. Obviously, it's no way to know for certain, no way, and many have argued, why would the Rambam need to hide that?
It's not juicy enough.
It's not so juicy. Essentially, as the Makbili Rambam Moreh Nevuchim points out, he says, one thing that's for sure clear is that the Rambam doesn't want us to poke over here. He's telling you, leave it alone. So just leave it alone. Stop trying to guess, right? Now, there is I showed you before this whole book, Ayin Tachas Ayin, written by a Chabad scholar, Eliyahu Matisov, and his theory is that what the Rambam means to say is that it depends if it's a Jew or a non-Jew. If you knock out the eye of a Jew, then you pay money. But if the non-Jew knocks out the eye, then we're gonna knock out his eye. Anyway, he's very, very excited about this idea, and he says that would make sense why the Rambam hides it. Yes. And based on this, and he has a whole chapter of how many different questions and problems with all different Rambams would all fall so neatly in line if only you would accept my suggestion that that this is what the Rambam means. This is going to be perfectly wonderful. Again, it's a thick book. Most of the book is actually about something else, but it's a good few pages just about this theory of his. However, you might not be surprised to hear that the Rambam has written some very juicy stuff about non-Jews, which he didn't seem to see the need to hide.
He's no Meiri, right?
No, not at all. And I'll tell you something very juicy. And this is so juicy that it was actually removed from any editions of the Rambam's commentary to the Mishnah because it was way too dangerous to publish. But nowadays we have it, and this is what the Rambam says. This is commenting to the Mishnah in the 4th chapter of Bava Kama, where it talks about differences in damages liable when a Jew does it, when a guy does it. And he says that if a person has a dispute with a guy, then it depends. If it's better for you, if it's going to be better for the Jew, if he goes to the secular courts, go to the secular courts. If it's going to be better to go to the Jewish courts, you take him to Jewish courts. This should not be difficult to you that we just treat them however we want. Just like you shouldn't wonder that you're allowed to slaughter animals, even though they did nothing wrong. Somebody who doesn't have complete human characteristics, I guess. Any Adam is not truly a person. He's just there for the purpose of man. Speaking or elaborating on this topic, Tzarech Sefer Nifrod warrants its own full work. Okay? I kid you not, those are the words of the Rambam. And so, whatever exactly the Rambam means, and how we interpret it and how we understand it, is, as the Rambam himself acknowledges, the topic of its own book unto itself. But Rabbi Maimon, who's the Mahadir who published in a wonderful edition which we have here in the library of Rabbi Avram ben Rambam's commentaries to the Torah, so in his footnotes he says, I find it hard to believe Rabbi Matisov's suggestion, if the Rambam could publish this, certainly he could publish.
Well, Maimon's saying that because he's a descendant of the Maimonides.
Okay.
He's sticking up for his ancestors.
All right. Now is the time when anybody who wants to leave is dismissed, and anybody who wants to ask further questions and discussion, the floor is yours. David Yehuda is first.
I think we should step back and we should say, what is the purpose of the law? Is it punitive? Is it preventative? Or is it civil law in which we're intending to... punitive is punitive. You're going to punish somebody. So is that the reason? Or is it to prevent people from gouging out other people's eyes, or are you just simply trying to get them money so that they can go on in their lives?
That's an excellent question, and one of the articles that I printed on this topic that I did not get the chance to read thoroughly is precisely on that topic.
They're all the same.
I have a printout of the article on my desk. It's in Hebrew, so you could Google translate it.
How's that sound?
Or maybe I'll get around to reading it and get back to what you said. But there's definitely that is certainly a relevant question.
In different terms.
But they
Okay, so I was jotting down a few questions, and one of them I was thinking, does this only apply to Jews? Okay, and started to address that. So where I'm going to go with this, and I don't know if you want to keep recording my question, but given the war in Gaza,
That's what I just
and
gonna say.
all the okay, I don't know if I'm just going to use a term here. I don't know if it's true. Collateral damage. People who are innocent get killed, maimed, their homes destroyed, whatever, their businesses. Is there an obligation for Eretz Yisrael, when this is all over, to compensate those people?
No, they have to go to the
pay that-
international court and ask for money.
They should go to The Hague.
And those
Okay.
terrorists have to be executed.
Okay, let's keep this. Let's keep this.
That's right.
He's talking about the collateral damage.
We're
talking about-
I think that first of all, it's a very, very good question, and you're planting an idea in my mind to maybe even do a full-blown class on that. But I think that the crux of the answer is going to be that there's a huge difference, and this is true both in Torah law and in secular, I believe, international law, that there's a difference between damages between two parties and war. And part of war is ugly, and part of war is collateral damage, and that's just part of the price you pay.
There's international treaties.
I'm gonna echo him on this, but like, the responsibility to pay for all the damage that's in Gaza is on Hamas. That's their elected body. They're the ones that should take care of it.
Let me rephrase. Let me rephrase.
Right?
Here, let me rephrase.
You
Steve's
reap what you sow.
So I'm gonna completely rephrase Steve's question. Israel, I don't know if this ever happened, but in theory, right? Israel fire a explosive, whatever, to Gaza, and somehow it does damage to a Jewish home in Sderot. Does the Israeli government have the responsibility to pay?
They do for that.
So I think that's probably included in your question, but
Yeah, because what happens in Gaza?
Because
what happens in Gaza is not our responsibility, right? They have an elected government, right? They
But I'm saying I want to try and divorce the question of all the very accurately unwarranted emotional response, and just
I'm
sort
not
of
complicit with what the Israeli
zoom
government does.
into
If I live in
the
Israel,
actual
I am
legal
under their governance.
part of the question.
If you live in
That's my
Gaza,
opinion.
you're under the governance of
That's
your
where I'm
elected
coming
body.
from.
Even if
Okay.
I didn't vote for
Right.
Netanyahu,
Right.
why am I
Torah.
responsible
It's part of
for
my-